so many people ask me this really simple question: how to get a better score? Well, I'm providing you with all the tips, so you just need to check what you're doing wrong. Once you check what you're doing wrong and you identify them, you need to understand how to do them right. You pretty much need to follow all of the previously mentioned tips that are unique to this task, such as vocabulary and structure, and also follow the following details. Phrases, transitions, and prepositions are words and phrases that give your essay coherence. We need them to join sentences and thoughts together. An example of the most common when you want to agree with something or add on to something is the following: agreement. Also, plus, in addition, further, furthermore. On the other hand, when you want to contrast, we use these words: however, contrastly, in contrast, on the contrary, on the other hand. You need to use articles as well, such as a and the. Articles are something that should be on everybody's checklist. Every time you use a noun, you have a decision to make about the article. These go wrong a lot. To get them right, you can ask yourself 2 questions. Is it countable, uncountable? Or, am I talking generally or particular? The next one I'm going to talk about is comparisons. Some of the most important languages in Task 1 is to compare and contrast vocabulary. This is because the instruction tells you to make comparisons where relevant. If you want to score well, you need to use some different ways to compare and contrast. One way to make comparisons is to start a new sentence with a word or phrase that shows that you're about to make a comparison with the previous sentence. The basic word you need here is in contrast. The most popular form of holiday amongst Welsh was self-catering, with over 60% choosing to cook for themselves. In contrast, only 5% of the English choose this form of vacation, and hotel accommodation was much more popular at 48%. In comparison, almost 50% of the English, Scots and Northern Irish choose to stay in hotels for their holiday. In comparison, staying in a self-catering accommodation was much less popular, with around 10% of people choosing this. However, the general pattern was for hotel accommodation to be the most popular, with around half of the people choosing it. The majority of the Welsh, however, chose to stay in self-catering accommodation. On the other hand, it is clear that a majority of the British choose to stay in hotels for their holiday. On the other hand, there was an exception to this because over 50% of the Welsh opted for self-catering accommodation. You need to make a note that normally we use a comma after in contrast and in comparison. Note that there are always a lot of different ways to use compare and contrast, and these are just some of the most basic examples. If you're looking for higher band scores, it's good advice to learn different ways to use these words. You need to learn to use comparisons within sentences as well, not just at the start. Another possibility is to compare 2 pieces of information within the same sentence. The basics words you need to learn are here. While there are 4 million miles of train lines in the UK, there are only 3 million in France, whereas the majority of the French prefer to travel to work by train. Only a small minority of the British do. Although 15% of the French read novels, only 5% of the British do. Almost 25% of French females study maths with a private tutor, but nearly 60% study English with one. Now let's move on to comparisons with more or less or fewer. This is another obvious way to make comparisons and contrasts. You should note though that you're normally going to compare numbers and nouns, not adjectives. You want to remember these 2 key bits of grammar. Now let's look at how we can use the word then, which is a really popular word when we're comparing. Remember that after the words more, less, fewer, we must use then. Let's have a look at an example. 5% more girls choose to read books than go to cinemas. Now let's look at the words fewer or less. If the word is uncountable, we use less. If it is countable, we use fewer. Let's have a look at an example. Fewer mobile phones were bought in 2013 than 2014. Less oil was consumed in 2013 than 2014. Now let's move on to looking at another area that I've noticed a lot of students have trouble with. Qualifying your comparisons with much, far, slightly, or a number. This is very similar to previous things I've mentioned. The idea here is that you still use less or more or fewer, but this time you explain how much. Typically, the best way to do this is to use a number. Now let's look at an example. Far fewer people choose to travel by train than by car. Where's the detail? Let's have a look at an example with detail. 25% fewer people choose to travel by train than by car. It's a lot better now that we've added detail, and you're going to get a higher score if you choose to do this. Now let's move on to comparisons with the words most, least, fewest. When you're looking for details to include, the highest or the lowest number is almost always important. This too is a form of comparison and is very popular in the IELTS exam. Let's look at an example. The most popular form of entertainment in the UK was going to the cinema. The least common form of transport was taking a taxi. If you look at these two comparisons, you can see that using these words really makes the sentence a lot better. And if you insist on using these words, you're going to make a better IELTS score. Now let's look at the word similar. And I'm going to show you an example of how we would use this because this word is used a lot. The percentage of females and males who studied languages at university were very similar. Now let's look at the word same as or just as. The percentage of females who studied at university in 2011 was almost exactly the same as in 2012. These types of words are very important for you to use. I suggest that you keep a list of them and try many ways of using them. Now let's move on to comparisons with numbers. Another way to make comparisons is to do some simple arithmetic. Here are some examples. Let's look at using the words more, less, fewer. 5 million fewer units of gas were sold in 2014. Here's another example using the word twice. Twice as many people elected to use gas and not electricity for cooking. The next part we're going to talk about is relative clauses. The idea here is that good IELTS grammar is about knowing how and when to use relative clauses, not just getting their grammar right. If you have trouble using relative clauses, there are non-specific to IELTS, so it's probably best that you learn this part just for general English purposes. Another important part that I want you to invest in learning is modal verbs. These verbs are essential for talking about the future. So what are modal verbs? Well, they're verbs like may, might, could, and will that we use with other verbs. The great thing about using them is that their grammar tends to be nice and easy. Even if you know how to use a modal verb, it can sometimes be confusing of when you use it. So let's start by thinking about when you might want to use a modal verb. It's language you can use in both speaking and writing, which is really handy. And it's useful whenever you're talking about events in the future, the present, or the past. The basic idea is that you use these modals when you're uncertain about something. They are usually an alternative to is, will, and was. They are useful for discussing probability and possibility.